On October 20th, 1945, a military plane landed in Nuremberg carrying prisoners. Among the passengers was a 34-year-old psychologist, the son of Austrian Jewish immigrants who spoke fluent German. His name was Gustav Mark Gilbert. It had free access. He could enter any cell at any time without asking permission. He would talk for a whole year with the men who had led the Third Reich into the abyss. Gustav Mark Gilbert was born in New York City on September 30th, 1911. He earned his Ph.D. in experimental psychology from Columbia University in 1939. When World War II broke out, he was commissioned to the United States Army and assigned as a translator, given his fluency in German. That linguistic ability would take him to a place where few academics would ever go, the Nuremberg prison, where the 22 most powerful men left alive from the Nazi regime were awaiting trial. His official appointment was that of prison psychologist and liaison officer. Colonel Burton C. Andrus, the prison's commander, granted unrestricted access to all prisoners from day one. Gilbert could enter without an escort. He could sit in the cells. He could talk about whatever he wanted. That freedom of movement was extraordinary, and Gilbert took advantage of it in a systematic way that no other researcher of the time would have been able to replicate. The psychiatrist who preceded him was Major Douglas M. Kelly, who was present during the first month of the trial. He was succeeded by Major Leon N. Goldenson, who served as a psychiatrist for most of the trial. Gilbert was not the official psychiatrist. That distinction fell to Kelly, and then to Goldenson. But the psychologist, the one who administered the intelligence tests, the Rorschach projective tests, the thematic apperception tests, and the one who spent more time in the cells than any other American official. His method was apparently informal. He would come in, talk, ask questions that didn't seem like questions. He never took notes in the presence of prisoners. He would go out, go to a private place, and write his notes immediately, as accurately as possible. Those notes became his diary, published in 1947 under the title Nuremberg Diary, a work that remains one of the most extraordinary primary sources of the psychology of totalitarianism. The difference between what Gilbert did and what a journalist would do was fundamental. Gilbert was not looking for statements for the public. He looked for thought patterns, defense mechanisms, personality structures, and when he found, he recorded them with the clinical coldness of someone who has already seen enough not to be surprised, but who still cannot stop being amazed. Before the formal trial began on November 20th, 1945, Gilbert used the period of solitary confinement that followed the indictment, read on October 20th, to establish individual contact with each prisoner, administer intelligence tests, and ask them to sign a copy of the indictment document with a spontaneous commentary. These first answers turned out to be instant portraits of character that further observation would only confirm. There is a persistent myth about the Nazi leaders that they were mediocre men, fanatics of limited intellectual capacities. The results of the intelligence tests administered by Gilbert in the Nuremberg prison destroyed that myth definitively. Gilbert used his own German adaptation of the Wechsler-Bellevue test for adults, removing those components that could be biased by cultural differences, such as vocabulary and general knowledge. The battery of tests consisted of 8 subtests, series of digits of increasing length to measure memory, arithmetic of progressive difficulty, common sense questions, formation of concepts by verbal similarities, a code replacement test, assembly of objects, similar to puzzles, reproduction of designs with color blocks, and recognition of missing parts in images. The IQs were calculated using the Wechsler-Bellevue method, which, unlike the Stanford-Binet scale, incorporates an adjustment for the natural decline of average intelligence with age. This allowed for fairer comparisons between men of very different ages. Göring was 52, von Schirach was 37. Although Gilbert cautioned that older men like von Papen, Raeder, Schacht and Streicher were likely to score 15 to 20 points lower than their results indicated, given the tendency for cognitive decline with age. The result that most shocked Gilbert, and Göring in particular, was the first in the ranking. Hjalmar Schacht, the so-called Wizard of Finance of the Reich, scored 143 points. In second place was Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the Austrian Chancellor who would later become Reich Commissar for the Netherlands, with 141 points. In third place, tied, came Hermann Göring and Karl Dönitz, with 138 points each. He was followed by Franz von Papen with 134, Admiral Erich Raeder with 134, Hans Frank with 130, Hans Fritzsche with 130, Baldur von Schirach with 130, Joachim von Ribbentrop with 129, Wilhelm Keitel with 129, Albert Speer with 128, Alfred Jodl with 127, Alfred Rosenberg with 127, Konstantin von Neurath with 125, Walter Funk with 124, Wilhelm Frick with 124, Rudolf Hess with 120, Fritz Saukel with 118, Ernst Kaltenbrunner with 113, and in last place Julius Streicher with 106. The average of the group was approximately 129 points. That puts it nearly 2 standard deviations above the average for the general population. Statistically speaking, that average score belongs to the smartest 2% of any population. They were not mediocre men. They were intelligent, many of them brilliant, and that, far from reassuring Gilbert, disturbed him deeply. Göring responded to the intelligence test with the attitude that characterized him in everything else: competitive, self-centered, and with an almost physical need to be the best. Gilbert recorded in his diary that when he administered the test, Göring reacted like a smug schoolboy anxious to impress the master, clapping his hands when he managed to complete the most difficult sets of digits and tapping the bed impatiently when he failed. When Gilbert told him that he had scored one of the highest scores in the group, without telling him that Schacht had surpassed him, Göring decided that American psychologists really had something there, much better than the methods German psychologists used at Wehrmacht testing stations. The news that Schacht, his lifelong rival in the economic domain of the Reich, had obtained the highest IQ did not reach Göring directly, but the implicit confirmation of that fact in the context of the trial fueled the hostility between the two that had been going on for years. Keitel, for his part, prepared for the intelligence test with the meticulousness of a Prussian officer. He tidied up his cell, cleaned the table, set aside the cards used after each item, and said he found the objectivity of the test superior to the silly nonsense with which German psychologists worked at Wehrmacht selection stations. He told Gilbert that the Marines were much smarter politically than the ground Marines because they had traveled and knew foreign temperaments. Gilbert's overall conclusion about the results was unequivocal. Intelligence does not protect against evil. It is not a shield against fanaticism. It does not prevent participation in mass crimes. The evidence from Nuremberg showed the opposite, that men perfectly capable of abstract reasoning, of strategic planning, of complex bureaucratic management can at the same time organize, direct, and execute the systematic extermination of millions of human beings. That was, in Gilbert's view, the most disturbing truth that the Nuremberg trial had produced. Hermann Wilhelm Göring arrived in Nuremberg as the highest-ranking defendant, Reichsmarschall, head of the Luftwaffe, president of the Reichstag, plenipotentiary of the 4-year plan, Hitler's designated successor. The list of his charges occupied more than 3 lines in the indictment document. It was, in all cases, senses, the de facto head of the group of defendants, and he knew it, and he exercised it with the arrogance of someone who still believes in power. When Göring arrived at Mondorf prison in Luxembourg before being transferred to Nuremberg, he arrived with 2 suitcases full of Paracoin pills. He had been addicted to opiates for years, an addiction that prison Doctors Miller and Kelly, had been reducing with decreasing doses. Colonel Andrus, the prison commander, was pleased to refer to this trial. When Göring came to me in Mondorf, I was a servile scumbag with 2 suitcases full of paracocaine. I thought he was a drug dealer, but we took him off his drug and turned him into a man. detoxified, Göring was a first-rate psychological specimen. Gilbert described it with clinical precision in his 1948 paper published in the Journal of Abnormal and Social Psychology under the title Hermann Göring, Amiable Psychopath. The combination of terms was not accidental. Göring was genuinely affable, humorous, widely informed, able to converse about art, music, military history, and international politics with the ease of a man of the world. And at the same time, his inability to acknowledge guilt, his pathological egotism, his constant manipulation of other prisoners to maintain a coherent party line, and his utter indifference to the human suffering his decisions had caused, constituted the classic picture of severe antisocial personality disorder. When Gilbert informed him of Robert Lay's suicide, Göring showed no emotion. His response was calculated. "It's okay that he's dead because I had my doubts about how he would behave in the trial. He has always been so absent-minded, always making those fantastic and bombastic speeches. I'm sure he would have made a fool of himself at the trial. Well, I'm not surprised he's dead because he was killing himself drinking anyway." In the first weeks of the trial, Göring sought to establish his de facto leadership over the group of defendants in a way that Gilbert found clinically revealing. In the dining room where the prisoners had lunch together, Göring set up a command table and waited for the other higher-ranking defendants to take their positions with respect to him. Frank described how, even in prison, Göring stopped before going out for a walk and waited for Frank to place himself on his left in the position of subordinate officer. "Can you imagine it even now in this prison?" Frank said to Gilbert, shaking his head. "I don't bother with him anymore." But Göring's tactics were more complex than the simple exercise of rank. Göring actively attempted to maintain what Gilbert called a united front among the defendants, a collective stance of cynicism toward judgment, of denial of collective guilt, and of defending the historical reputation of the Third Reich and Hitler in particular. To maintain that front, Göring pressured, flattered, threatened covertly, and controlled the conversations in the dining room with the same political instinct that had brought him to power in Germany. His attitude toward judgment was one of open cynicism. From day one, and no matter how much documentary evidence was presented against him, Göring maintained the position that the trial was a political matter of the victors, and that he could answer for all that he had done, but not for what he had not done. In private conversations with Gilbert, he was noticeably more blunt. "Naturally, do you think it would rebuild again? Of course I would rearm. I would rearm Germany until it was full of arms. I'm just sorry I didn't rebuild even more. As for international treaties, naturally I considered them, among us, as mere dead paper." His reaction when he saw the concentration camp film screened in the courtroom on November 29, 1945, was characteristic. Uncomfortable because of the effect the film had on the other defendants rather than because of the content itself. "It was such a good afternoon until they showed that movie," he told Gilbert that night. "They were reading my phone conversations about the Austrian affair, and everyone was laughing with me. And then they showed that horrible movie and it ruined everything." In Göring, during the whole year of the trial, there was no genuine sign of remorse. His suicide, committed on the night of October 15, 1946, a few hours before the death sentence by hanging was to be carried out, was the last act of control that was available to him. Rudolf Hess arrived at Nuremberg prison from England in a state of apparent total amnesia. He didn't recognize anyone. He didn't remember anything from the past. Among his belongings were small packages of food samples that he had wrapped, sealed, and labeled during a period of paranoid delusions about poisoning his food. He sat in his cell in a state of apathetic absence, giving no sign of familiarity with any mentioned subject of the past, including his own flight to Scotland on May 10, 1941. Hess had arrived in Scotland alone, piloting a Messerschmitt Bf 110 without authorization and without warning, in a seemingly personal attempt to negotiate peace with Britain. The impact on the Nazi hierarchy had been devastating. Hitler was enraged. Göring had to publicly declare that one of the highest leaders in the Reich was insane. It was a political humiliation of the first order, and Göring never forgave it. Does Hitler believe that he would have sent the third man of the Reich on a solo mission to England without the slightest preparation? Asked Göring to Gilbert indignantly. Hitler was furious when he found out. Do you think it was a pleasure for us to have to publicly declare that one of our top leaders was crazy? Hess's amnesia at Nuremberg was subjected to exhaustive psychiatric scrutiny. An American commission consisting of Dr. Nolan D.C. Lewis of Columbia University, Dr. Donald E. Cameron of McGill University, and Colonel Paul Schroeder of Chicago examined him in his cell, with Gilbert as his interpreter. The conclusion was that Hess was not legally insane, although his amnesia seemed genuine. When he was shown a Nazi film in which his own image appeared, he showed no reaction. The revelation came on November 30th, 1945, during a closed session of the court convened to determine whether Hess was competent to defend himself. When his defense attorney, Dr. Rorschach, began arguing that Hess was incompetent, Hess wrote a note and asked that it be turned over to his attorney, who ignored it. Then Hess interrupted the proceedings with a statement, "My memory is back in order. The reasons I simulated memory loss were tactical." The court dissolved in chaos. The defense attorney was completely taken aback, not knowing whether his client had faked amnesia before or was faking it now. Göring, when he heard about it, roared with pleasure, believing that Hess had played a masterful joke on the psychiatrists. Von Schirach said, eyes wide with amazement, "Well, that's the end of scientific psychology." When Gilbert visited Hess in his cell that night, Hess's memory was perfectly in order. He was able to answer questions about his imprisonment, about his flight to Scotland, about his role in the party. When Gilbert asked him what Hitler had said when he learned of the flight, Hess bristled. "I don't know what he said, and I don't want to know. I'm not interested." Repeated intelligence tests showed a moderate improvement in memory, but Hess made some of the same mistakes as before. His contention that he could have gotten better results if he had tried harder was not supported by the evidence of the tests. What Gilbert interpreted clinically was this: Hess had a hysterical personality. The amnesia had been, at least in part, a defensive response to the greatest humiliation of his life: Hitler's publicly declaring him insane. When he arrived in Nuremberg, surrounded by his former teammates, the risk of that same rejection was once again unbearable. When Gilbert warned him that he probably wouldn't be let back on trial if he continued to appear incompetent, Hess decided it was time to end the game. During the trial, Hess manifested continuous paranoid tendencies. Göring said that Hess made comments about a machine installed under his cell to drive him crazy with the noise of the engine, that when the coffee was too hot, he assumed they wanted to burn it. When he was cold, they wanted to disturb him. The only prisoner who had arrived in Nuremberg with sealed food parcels to prevent poisoning. The sentence imposed in the end was life imprisonment. Hess would die on August 17, 1987, at the age of 93, in the Spandau prison in West Berlin, the last prisoner of that facility. Joachim von Ribbentrop, foreign minister of the Third Reich, the man who had signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in August 1939 that paved the way for the invasion of Poland, arrived in cell number 7 of Nuremberg prison as a ghostly version of the arrogant diplomat he had been. Gilbert described it with a precision that is almost cruel in its accuracy. The bankruptcy of the system that had backed up his diplomacy with armed force had taken out the whole false backbone of his weak character. What was left was a confused and demoralized opportunist in defeat, without even a consistent argument to maintain a presentable front. In the weeks leading up to the trial, Ribbentrop would write endless memos and ask for advice from anyone who approached him: doctors, cell guards, food delivery men, the barber. The German prison doctor observed that if there had been a janitor at the facility, von Ribbentrop would have also asked him for advice on his defense of Nazi foreign policy. In pre-trial interrogations, Ribbentrop frequently complained of memory lapses and asked interrogators what they thought about everything. Göring, who never had esteem for him, described Gilbert as a boundless egotist. a wine salesman who was successful in business but who had neither the baggage nor the tact for diplomacy. And he added, in the tone of one who believes he has the authority to judge the competence of others. When he was presented to the King of England, he greeted him with the salute, Heil Hitler, which the English naturally considered an insult to the crown. Ribbentrop had an obsessive need to talk about Hitler's magnetic personality. After the documentary film of the Nazi rise to power, which included footage of Hitler in action, was shown at the trial, Ribbentrop wept. Not of remorse, but of longing. "Can't you feel the terrible force of your personality?" he asked Gilbert, his eyes moistening. "I don't know if you can, but we can feel it." And then, in his cell that night, he went even further. "Even with everything I know, if Hitler came to me right now, I simply could not give him up." This inability to separate himself psychologically from Hitler was, for Gilbert, one of the most significant features of Ribbentrop's profile. It wasn't just political loyalty, it was something that was more like an emotional dependence, the structure of thought of someone who had never had a conviction of his own but had appropriated the convictions of those closest to power. Inconsistency was the dominant feature. One day, Ribbentrop claimed that he had warned the English that they would fight. The next day, he said that he could never contradict Hitler after Hitler shouted at him in 1940. One day he insisted that the Munich Pact had not been legally violated. The next day he admitted that it was absolutely a broken promise. When Gilbert pointed out the contradictions, Ribbentrop smiled obsequiously and assured him that he, Gilbert, did not understand such things. The court found him guilty on all 4 counts. He was executed by hanging on October 16, 1946, the first of the condemned to be taken to the gallows in the gymnasium of Nuremberg prison. Wilhelm Keitel, Feldmarschall, Chief of the Wehrmacht High Command, was the embodiment of the old-school Prussian officer with one fundamental difference. Without his insignia, without his rank, without his uniform, Keitel had no backbone. Gilbert watched him bow and apologized to any lieutenant who came to see him, proclaiming to anyone who would listen that he was a very insignificant man. That self-devaluation was, in itself, a defense mechanism. Keitel was trying to present himself as someone who had had no real power, who only transmitted orders, who had no command function. When asked by Gilbert about his reaction to the indictment, Keitel had underlined the passage that upheld the collective responsibility of all members of the conspiracy and rejected the excuse of following orders. "How can you accuse me of conspiring to wage a war of aggression when I was nothing more than the mouth that conveyed the wishes of the Führer?" asked Keitel. As Chief of Staff, he had no authority at all, no command function, nothing. All he could do was relay his orders to the staff and see them executed. When presented with orders signed by him, orders to execute 50 or 100 communists for every German soldier killed in the East, orders to hand over paratroopers to the SD for execution, orders removing the protections of international law on the Eastern Front, Keitel invariably replied that he was only carrying out orders and that this was what was expected of an officer. What disturbed Keitel most, according to Gilbert's analysis, was not the accusation that he had participated in the conduct of a war that killed tens of millions of people. It was the accusation of having participated in the assassination plots against the French General Giraud and the officer who escaped from a prison camp. Those stories, in Keitel's code of values, attacked his honor as an officer, which was qualitatively different and worse than having signed mass execution orders. Alfred Jodl, General of Operations of the High Command, was different from Keitel in one important respect. He had a character of his own. Rigid, not very communicative at first, Jodl acquired a greater articulation as the trial progressed. He told the tribunal that Hitler had been a masterpiece of secrecy and a masterpiece of deception through Himmler. Jodl confided to Gilbert in his cell that his feelings for Hitler had always oscillated between admiration and hatred. The things that made him hate Hitler were precisely those that touched on his social identity. Hitler's contempt for the middle class with which Jodl identified, his suspicion and hatred of the nobility to whom Jodl was related by marriage, and his distrust and hatred of the general staff of which Jodl was a member. The most telling scene about Jodl was when Gilbert asked him directly if he condemned those who had attempted to assassinate Hitler on July 20th, 1944, knowing what he now knew. Jodl stopped midway through blowing his nose. He thought for almost half a minute. Finally he replied, "Well, if you had known then what we know now, that's different." But he refused to go any further. The double treatment, the duplicity, disgusted him. An officer had to either follow orders or resign. He could not shake hands with the leader and then arrange for his assassination. The court's conviction was unanimous for Jodl, guilty on all 4 counts, hanged on October 16, 1946. Hans Frank was Hitler's lawyer, the Governor-General of occupied Poland, the man who had overseen a territory in which approximately 3 million Jews were murdered. When he arrived at Nuremberg prison, he had visible marks of his suicide attempt when he was captured, a scar on his throat and the little finger of his left hand with reduced mobility due to wounds on his wrists. He read the Bible. He had converted to Catholicism. And when Gilbert entered his cell, the ferocity of his repentance was almost theatrical, although Gilbert ended up convincing himself of his sincerity. The conversations with Frank were the most intense in Gilbert's diary. Frank spoke with genuine literary ease, transitioning seamlessly from political analysis to the tone of the biblical prophets. On Hitler, "If only one of us had had the courage to shoot him dead, that's the only thing I reproach myself for. What misery, what death, and what destruction would have been avoided. I began to come to my senses in 1942, and I realized what evil was embodied in him." Frank had protested against the measures of terror in Poland in 1942 and had been stripped of military rank and political power as a consequence, although Hitler had left him seated as a puppet governor-general. The way Frank described that was psychologically sophisticated. That was the satanic evil in him. And so here I am, and I deserve it because I was in cahoots with the devil in the beginning. His description of Hitler was that of someone who had studied the problem closely. That so-called fascinating gaze of his was nothing more than the gaze of an insensitive psychopath. He was moved by primitive, pure volitional egotism, unrestrained in any form or convention. That is why he hated all legal, diplomatic, and religious institutions, the social values that represented restrictions on his impulsive expression of ego. Frank dreamed. His dreams were those of a man reconciled to death, but not to the horror of what he had participated in. He described to Gilbert dreams of vast seas, high mountains, and open skies. These dreams take me much further from the confines of this cell. In a recent one, Hitler had appeared in the vision in court and told him, "You have sworn allegiance unto death. Come." Frank described this with such dramatic fervor and secret confidence that Gilbert, for a moment, almost suspected a hallucination. The way Frank responded to verification questions dispelled any doubts about his normal orientation. Gilbert's implicit diagnosis of Frank was that of a man of high intelligence, CI 130, with a deeply narcissistic personality structure who had found in Catholicism and public repentance a new stage for the theater of the self. The remorse was genuine, but the performance of remorse was also genuine. Guilty on counts 3 and 4, executed on October 16, 1946. Hjalmar Horace Greeley Schacht, president of the Reichsbank, Minister of Economics, was the man with the highest IQ of all the defendants, and he knew it, and he made no effort to conceal it. He had spent the 10 months before being detained by the Americans in a concentration camp on suspicion of conspiring against Hitler, and his indignation at finding himself in the dock alongside criminals whom he considered infinitely worse than himself was constant, articulate, and refreshingly sincere in its arrogance. Several of the defendants are not guilty. Most are direct criminals. Schacht told Gilbert on October 23, 1945, with the nonchalance of one who is giving a situation report. Even Ribbentrop should be hanged for his stupidity. There is no worse crime than stupidity. When Gilbert pointed out to him that such a trial was a good thing for history and science, Schacht replied that all he needed was half an hour on the stand because his opposition to Hitler's aggressive policies is an open book. After all, he put me in a concentration camp for it. Schacht's psychology was that of a genuine intellectual with colossally inflated self-esteem and a real capacity for self-deception. He had financed Germany's rearmament with remarkable ingenuity, minting unbacked notes in practice, creating financial instruments that allowed for covert military spending, and then when Hitler began to absorb all of the country's financial resources into unlimited weaponry, Schacht withdrew his cooperation and was progressively marginalized. In 1944, he was arrested and sent to Flossenbürg. What Schacht could not admit, and which Gilbert recorded with clinical care, was that his initial funding of the regiment had been indispensable to the regiment becoming what it was. Schacht had helped build the machine and then protested what the machine did. The distinction was real in a chronological sense, but the court found it insufficient to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt on charges of conspiracy to war of aggression. The verdict was not guilty. Schacht was released. Julius Streicher was the only one of the Nuremberg defendants on whom there was a unanimous consensus among the others that he fell short of the minimum standards they applied to their own peers. Schacht hated it. Göring despised him. Frank found it disgusting. And his own defense lawyers wondered if his anti-Semitic obsession didn't stem from a sick mind. Streicher had founded and directed for decades the weekly Der Stürmer, an anti-Semitic propaganda publication of an explicitly pornographic and eschatological nature that reached a circulation of 2 million copies. He had been removed from his position as Gauleiter of Franconia in 1940 on charges of corruption and for spreading a rumor that Göring's son was a test tube baby. Even among the Nazis, Streicher had been too much for some. In Nuremberg prison, Streicher did what he had done all his adult life: lecture on anti-Semitism to anyone who came close. When psychiatrists came to examine him, Dr. Krasnushkin of Moscow, Colonel Schroeder of Chicago, and Dr. Delay of Paris, Streicher turned the examination into a seminar on the Jewish question. When doctors asked her to undress for the physical exam and the Russian interpreter turned to the door, Streicher said, "What's wrong with her? Are you afraid to see something beautiful?" The young woman trembled with revulsion. The psychiatric conclusion was that Streicher suffered from a neurotic obsession, but that he was not legally insane. His IQ was 106, the lowest of the entire group. But Gilbert observed something more significant: that when he conversed with him about anti-Semitism, Streicher's mental pattern was not that of a strategic propagandist, but that of someone who genuinely believed in everything he said, who found in anti-Semitism a source of intellectual stimulation and almost perverse aesthetic pleasure. What made Streicher unique was not the violence of his convictions, but his essentially libidinous nature. Streicher's anti-Semitism was deeply entangled with sexuality, with voyeurism, with a morbid curiosity masquerading as racial erudition. When he saw the film of the concentration camps, he admitted that it was terrible, showing no apparent feeling, and then asked if the guards couldn't make less noise at night so that he could sleep. Guilty in Count 4, executed on October 16, 1946. Baldur von Schirach was 17 years old when he read an American book entitled The International Jew, attributed to Henry Ford. He was, by his own testimony, impressionable, of aristocratic origin, raised in an environment where there was a silent prejudice against Jews in the best circles. The book confirmed their prejudices, or rather gave them a structure. A year later, he met Hitler in Munich and became one of his most fanatical followers. Von Schirach was the leader of the Hitler Youth from 1933, the organization that subjected German youth to an indoctrination program unprecedented in German history. He was then appointed Gauleiter of Vienna, where he oversaw the deportation of tens of thousands of Jews to the ghettos and camps of the East. In the Nuremberg prison, von Schirach was the most outwardly composed of those who admitted some degree of guilt. He wrote a poem entitled "To Death." Aware of his heritage in German nobility and culture, he told his lawyer at their first meeting, "As long as I can hold my head high, I will hold it." His first long conversation with Gilbert, a week after receiving the indictment, produced one of the most revealing passages in the diary. Von Schirach explained how he came to anti-Semitism, attributing responsibility to his youth, to Streicher's influence, to authority figures who treated anti-Semitism as academically respectable, and finally to Ford. Why didn't anyone tell us that Ford had repudiated the Jew International and that the Protocols of Zion were a forgery? Why all these historical and scientific lies to breed hatred in impressionable youthful minds? Von Schirach's denunciation of Hitler during the trial in May 1946 was the first real break in the united front that Göring had been trying to maintain for months. Von Schirach declared on the stand that Hitler was a murderer and that the Germans had been betrayed. Göring, sitting in the dock, had to make visible efforts to control his reaction. That night, Göring called von Schirach a scoundrel for having spoken thus of the Führer. The next day at lunchtime, he tried to intimidate von Papen on the same ground. The front had been definitively broken. Gilbert observed in von Schirach something that was almost the positive version of Ribbentrop's profile. Someone who had never had a genuine conviction of his own, who had adopted the convictions of the closest authority figures, first Ford through a book, then Streicher himself, then Hitler in the flesh. The difference was that when that edifice of borrowed convictions collapsed, von Schirach had the ability to recognize it. Ribbentrop never had it. Guilty in count 4, sentenced to 20 years in prison. Albert Speer was the defendant who most made Gilbert most morally uncomfortable, precisely because he was the most intelligent about his own guilt. An architect by training, appointed Minister of Armaments and Munitions in 1942 with no previous experience in the post, Speer had organized German war production with a technocratic efficiency that prolonged the war several years longer than it would have lasted without his intervention. That extension of the war cost millions of additional lives, and Speer knew it. He did not try to hide behind ignorance or behind orders. His position from day one was that the process was necessary, that there was a collective responsibility in the Nazi leadership for the crimes committed, and that the excuse of following orders was inadmissible in an authoritarian system precisely because the tacit consent of all levels of leadership was what made the system possible. What Speer openly acknowledged was his own willful blindness. He knew enough about forced labor, about the conditions in the labor camps, to have suspected what was going on in the death camps. He didn't want to know. It was more comfortable not to know. I know I had no illusions about his fate before, so the indictment was no particular shock to me, he told Gilbert on October 23rd. Hitler, told me in March that all was lost and that we should save Germany from total destruction regardless of the personal consequences. Hitler replied that if Germany could not win the war, it did not deserve to survive. When he attempted to sabotage Hitler's scorched earth policy in the final months of the war, traveling through Germany to convince local officials to disobey orders to destroy, Speer was risking his life. That act was recognized by the court as a mitigating factor. But Speer had also done something that Gilbert accurately recorded that didn't fit the image of the remote technocrat. He had continued to use slave labor in his ministry to the end. He had asked for workers from Sokol, the person responsible for the recruitment of forced labor, knowing full well that these workers arrived under duress from the occupied territories. Guilty on counts 3 and 4, sentenced to 20 years in prison. Alfred Rosenberg was the official ideologue of the National Socialist Party, author of The Myth of the 20th Century, the reference text of Nazi racism, and Reichsminister for the occupied Eastern Territories, where he designed and supervised the policies of exploitation, Germanization, and extermination. His IQ was 127, not the highest of the group, but enough to produce the theoretical instruments of genocide. What caught Gilbert's attention most in Rosenberg was his evasion. When other defendants, such as Frank or von Schirach, openly acknowledged having participated in something horrible, Rosenberg always returned to the argument that he had only sought a peaceful solution to the racial problem. When Frank asked him in the dining room, in front of other defendants and Gilbert, "Did all that racial politics make sense anyway?" Rosenberg was silent. When he finally responded, he said, "Of course, we didn't expect it to lead to such terrible things as mass murder and war. I was just looking for a peaceful solution to the racial problem." The discussion of the Inquisition between Frank, Rosenberg, Kaltenbrunner, and Seyss-Inquart in the dining room during von Pappen's trial was one of the most important of the most revealing exchanges in the newspaper. Frank, ominously, began by comparing the Inquisition to Nazi crimes, as if the two were part of the same continuum of human barbarism, and even seemed to find something darkly amusing in the comparison. Rosenberg joined, delighted to have Frank admit that the history of the Catholic Church was dishonorable, and Kaltenbrunner added details about Torquemada with the tone of someone who is contributing to an academic discussion, without any of the three seeming to perceive the obscenity of them being the ones discussing the crimes of others, guilty on all 4 counts, executed on October 16, 1946. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, chief of the Reich Security Central Office, which included the Gestapo, the SD, and the criminal police, from January 1943, came to the defendant's stand weeks after the others, due to a cerebral hemorrhage suffered during the trial. When he finally appeared, with his enormous stature and his face marked by deep scars, the effect on his co-defendants was immediate and physical. Gilbert described the moment. A chill swept over the defendant's bench as if an icy gust had come through the open door. Kaltenbrunner apparently expected a favorable reception and began to greet his teammates. No one answered. Jodl, the one closest to the door, was practically forced to shake his hand when Kaltenbrunner held it out. Frank didn't even lift his eyes from his book, though, as Gilbert passed by him, Frank nodded in Kaltenbrunner's direction and said quietly, "Look at that profile. Interesting, right?" His IQ of 113 placed him as the second lowest in the group, but Kaltenbrunner represented something different from what his relative intelligence suggested. He was the only one of the defendants who had had direct control over the killing machine during its last 2 years of operation. Under his direction, the RSHA oversaw the murder of approximately 4 million Jews in concentration camps, in addition to the 2 million executed by the Einsatzgruppen. Kaltenbrunner consistently denied any responsibility, arguing that it was merely an intelligence agency. The court did not find it convincing. Guilty on counts 3 and 4, executed on October 16, 1946. Admiral Karl Dönitz, who had succeeded Hitler as German head of state during the final 11 days of the Reich before the capitulation, and Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, who had built and commanded the German Navy for 15 years, represented at the trial the case of the military men who believed they had fulfilled their obligations to simply their professional duty, without participating in the ideological crimes of the regime. Dönitz, with an IQ of 138, tied with Göring, was the most intelligent and the most emotionally articulate of the defendants in military uniform. When he saw the film of the concentration camps, his reaction was genuinely indignant. "How can they accuse me of knowing such things? They ask why I didn't go to Himmler to check out the concentration camps. That's absurd. He would have fired me just as I would have thrown him out if he had come to investigate the Navy." Gilbert described him as someone who gave the impression of being an innocent boy in a den of gangsters and politicians. That image was partially correct. Dönitz had genuinely stayed out of the regime's ideological crimes. But his own orders on submarine warfare, specifically the order effectively prohibiting the rescue of survivors of sunken ships, had violated the international law of maritime warfare. Raeder, for his part, was the first to conceive of the invasion of Norway in violation of Norwegian neutrality. He acknowledged having violated the Treaty of Versailles in the naval rearmament program, although he presented it as a matter of honor for any German. What united Dönitz and Raeder was their contempt for the politicians, Göring, von Schirach, Frank, Ribbentrop, whom they held responsible for initiating the war and the crimes. Within the framework of that vision, they had simply been soldiers doing what was expected of soldiers. The question that Gilbert did not fail to ask them in various ways was the same. At what point does the fulfillment of professional duty become complicity in crime? Dönitz, guilty on counts 2 and 3, 10 years in prison. Raeder, guilty on counts 1, 2 and 3, life imprisonment. Walter Funk, Schacht's successor as Minister of Economics and President of the Reichsbank, wept when he saw the film of the camps. He wept again when the tribunal presented evidence about the agreement he had signed with Himmler in 1942, by which the Reichsbank received gold and jewelry from the SS, the gold from the dental fillings and glasses of the victims of the death camps, the personal jewelry taken from those who were taken to the gas chambers. Funk claimed that he did not know what the SS was sending. The court found that he either knew or deliberately refused to know. His IQ of 124 was respectable. His character was that of a man who functioned well in times of prosperity and who crumbled under any real moral pressure. Gilbert observed him crying regularly, asking for sleeping pills, repeating, "Horrible, horrible," without that seeming to translate into any understanding of his own responsibility. Wilhelm Frick, Minister of the Interior during the early years of the Reich, was the legal architect of the machinery of persecution. He drafted, signed, and administered the laws that suppressed trade unions, that persecuted churches, that laid the foundation for the Nuremberg laws of 1935, that virtually deprived Jews of citizenship. His reaction to the indictment was that of a lawyer. The entire indictment rests on the assumption of a fictitious conspiracy. Fritz Sauckel, Gauleiter of Thuringia and head of the Reich's labor conscription, was responsible for a program that had deported more than 5 million human beings to work in slave-like conditions in Germany. His own statement of March 1, 1944, was recorded in the file. Of the 5 million workers who came to Germany, less than 200,000 came voluntarily. When he saw the film of the camps, his face twitched. "I would choke myself with these hands if I thought I had the slightest thing to do with those murders," he shouted, waving his trembling fingers. Sauckel, guilty on counts 3 and 4, executed on October 16, 1946. Konstantin von Neurath, Minister of Foreign Affairs in the early years of the Nazi regime and later Protector of Bohemia and Moravia, was the representative of German diplomacy of the Wilhelmina era, who had lent his respectability to the regime to give it a semblance of normality to the world. When the tribunal read the documents showing the policies of Germanization and terror under his administration in the Protectorate, von Neurath protested that he had been unable to do anything about it, that he had resigned as soon as he could. The court found that he had remained in office long enough to oversee the abolition of the free press, political parties and trade unions, and to administer a territory where war crimes were being committed. Franz von Papen was the most complex character in the group from Gilbert's perspective. Reich Chancellor before Hitler, he had been the politician who maneuvered for Hitler to be appointed Chancellor in January 1933, convinced that he could control him from the cabinet. It was in that illusion that the whole tragedy of von Papen as a historical figure resided. He was a man of impeccable courtesy, 70 years old, who showed irritability only when some physical discomfort disturbed him. With Gilbert, he was expansive about Hitler. He was a pathological liar, that's obvious. I can't understand it exactly. I think he wanted the best for Germany at first, but he became a force for evil without reasoning with the flattery of his supporters. Von Papen argued during the trial that he had remained in government and then as ambassador to Austria and Turkey to try to do good to avoid greater evils. This was the same logic that many collaborators of totalitarian regimes have employed at all times. The logic that it is better to be inside than outside, that moderate influence from within outweighs impotence from without. The tribunal did not find sufficient evidence that von Papen had been involved in the planning of wars of aggression in the legal sense. Verdict: not guilty. Von Papen was released. On November 29, 1945, the tribunal screened a documentary prepared by the American forces about the concentration camps as they had been found by the Allied troops when they were liberated. Gilbert and Kelly were stationed at both ends of the dock with instructions to observe and take notes during the screening. Gilbert's notes during that hour of film constitute one of the most extraordinary psychological documents of the 20th century. Every minute or so, Gilbert recorded the behavior of each defendant. At intervals of 1 or 2 minutes, the notes are: Schacht objects to being shown the film, turns, folds his arms, looks into the gallery. Fritzsche already looks pale and is dismayed when he begins with scenes of prisoners burned alive in a barn. Keitel wipes his forehead, takes off his headphones. Hess looks at the screen, looking like a spectre with his eyes sunk into the lamp on the floor. Von Neurath has his head down. He doesn't look. Funk covers his eyes, seems in agony, shakes his head. Ribbentrop closes his eyes, looks away. Frank swallows, blinks, trying to hold back tears. Fritzsche stares intently with a frown, twitching at the end of his seat, evidently in agony. Göring is still leaning against the railing, not looking most of the time, looking drowsy. Funk whispers something under his breath. Stryker is still looking, motionless except for the occasional frown. Funk now cries, covers his mouth with his hand when naked corpses of women are thrown into a pit. Stryker shows signs of disturbance for the first time. The film ends. The scene that followed in the cell ward that night was equally extraordinary. Fritzsche burst into tears as soon as Gilbert closed the door of his cell without being asked. "No power in heaven or on earth will erase this shame from my country, not in generations, not in centuries." She shook with her sobs. "Excuse the fact that I lost control, but I had to sit there and hold him for a whole hour." Von Schirach seemed relatively composed, but he said, "I don't know how the Germans could do such things." Frick made feeble attempts at rationalization about the disruption of communications in recent months, and then changed the subject and asked if they weren't going to take them out for a walk. Funk was so depressed that he burst into tears as soon as the movie was mentioned to him. "Horrible, horrible," he repeated in a choked voice. When asked if he needed a sleeping pill, he sobbed, "What for? What for?" Stryker admitted that the film was terrible without showing any apparent feeling, and then asked if the guards couldn't make less noise in the evenings. Speer showed no external emotional effects, but said he was even more determined to recognize the collective responsibility of the party leadership and to absolve the German people of blame. Frank was extremely depressed and agitated. As soon as the movie was mentioned, she began to cry in shame and anger. "To think that we lived like kings and believed in that beast. Don't let anyone tell you that you didn't have any ideals. Everyone sensed that something was horribly wrong with this system, even if we didn't know all the details. They didn't want to know. It was too comfortable to live off the system, to keep our families in regal style, and to believe that everything was fine. They treat us too well," he said, pointing to the food on the table which he hadn't touched. "Their prisoners and our own people were starving in our camps. May God have mercy on our souls." Sokol was completely collapsed. His face twitched and trembled from head to toe. "I would choke myself with these hands if I thought I had the slightest thing to do with those murders. It's a shame." Schacht was burning with indignation. "How dare they make me sit there with those criminals and watch a movie about the atrocities of the concentration camps?" And Göring that night, when Gilbert visited him. "It was such a good afternoon until they showed that film. They were reading my telephone conversations about the Austrian affair, and everyone was laughing with me, and then they showed that horrible movie, and it ruined everything." Hans Fritzsche, head of the radio division of Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda, was the only defendant whose presence in the dock was questioned by many, including several of his colleagues. Göring went so far as to say, "I had never heard of Fritzsche." Fritzsche had the same EQ as Frank, 130. And he was, in some respects, the most tormented of all, not because he had participated directly in the crimes like Frank, but precisely because he was fully aware of the role that propaganda had played in making those crimes possible, and of his own participation in that propaganda. When he saw the film of the camps, he was the first to collapse. When Gilbert visited him that night, he told him that the previous Friday and Saturday had been the first days of his life when he could not pray. It was beyond my wildest imagination. What Fritzsche put into words was something Gilbert found especially valuable. The perspective of someone who had genuinely believed in the Reich's mission, who had been involved in building the mental apparatus that made it possible for millions of Germans to turn a blind eye to crimes, and who now had to live with it. Someone has to answer for it, Fritzsche told Gilbert. But let us explain our position before the world, so that we may not at least die under this horrible burden of shame. The tribunal, in one of its most surprising verdicts, found Fritzsche not guilty, considering that his radio broadcasts, although propagandistic in nature, were not intended to incite the German people to commit atrocities against the conquered peoples. On October 1st, 1946, the International Military Tribunal read the verdicts. 11 of the 22 defendants were sentenced to death by hanging. 3 were acquitted. The rest received sentences of 10 years to life imprisonment. Sentenced to death: Göring, Ribbentrop, Keitel, Kaltenbrunner, Rosenberg, Frank, Frick, Streicher, Saukel, Jodl, Seyss-Inquart, and in absentia, Martin Bormann. Sentenced to life imprisonment: Hess, Funk, Raeder. Sentenced to lesser sentences: Dönitz, 10 years, von Schirach, 20 years, Speer, 20 years, von Neurath, 15 years. Acquitted: Schacht, von Papen, Fritzsche. The reactions of the defendants upon hearing their sentences were, once again, psychologically revealing. Göring showed no expression when his own was read. He later told Gilbert, "Death does not worry me excessively." Dönitz said, "I'm very disappointed with the verdict." Frank said, "Deserved it." Keitel turned visibly pale. Hess looked confused as always. Ribbentrop had a visible tremor in his hands. Göring managed to evade the gallows. On the night of October 15th, 1946, a few hours before his scheduled execution, he ingested a potassium cyanide capsule that he had managed to hide for months in prison. The exact circumstances of how he obtained the capsule have never been fully clarified. He died at 10:44 p.m., approximately 2 hours before the other convicts were taken to the prison gymnasium. The remaining 10 men were executed by hanging during the early morning of October 16, 1946. The first was Ribbentrop. The last one was Seyss-Inquart. The executions were carried out by Sergeant Major John C. Woods of the United States Army. When Gilbert wrote his book, The Nuremberg Diary, published in 1947, and then his more formal study, The Psychology of Dictatorship, published in 1950, the question that structured all his thinking was the same one that had led him to Nuremberg. What kind of human beings do these things? The answer that the year in the cells of Nuremberg had given him was disturbing in its complexity. They weren't monsters in the sense of being fundamentally different from normal human beings. They were people of above-average intelligence, many of them with academic training, with respectable previous careers, with families, with a sense of humor. What set them apart was not a congenital anomaly, but a combination of personality traits, institutional pressures, and historical conditions that had produced the result. What Gilbert identified in terms of individual personality traits could be summarized as follows. In Göring, pathological egotism and extreme narcissism, combined with genuine intellectual capacity, total absence of functional empathy, compulsive need for domination and admiration, a philosophical cynicism that allowed him to rationalize any action in terms of power and result. In Hess, a hysterical personality with paranoid tendencies, prone to psychological flight under extreme pressure. Total emotional dependence on the figure of the leader. In Ribbentrop, almost total absence of an autonomous character. a personality that only existed based on its relationship with power, unable to have an opinion of his own or to sustain it under any kind of pressure. In Keitel, obedience erected in moral philosophy, the inability to conceive that obedience can be a crime in itself when what is obeyed are criminal orders. In Frank, brilliant intelligence combined with weakness of character that had led him to participate in crimes that his own intelligence allowed him to clearly see as crimes. Genuine repentance did not erase that contradiction. In Streicher, an obsession of a neurotic nature with libidinously perverse components, which had become the engine of a decades-long hate campaign. In von Schirach, the character clay of someone whose convictions were always borrowed, and who was able, when the borrowing scaffolding collapsed, to recognize the error and articulate it publicly. In Speer, the cognitive dissociation of the technocrat, capable of dividing his world into the sphere of technical competence, where his work was legitimate, and the sphere of crimes, about which he deliberately did not want to know much. But what Gilbert found most significant, and which he articulated in a later essay, was group structure. Individually, many of these men might have had respectable or at least non-criminal careers. In the Third Reich system, their individual traits were articulated in a collective machinery. Göring's narcissism required Keitel's servility. Göring's philosophical cynicism complemented Ribbentrop's moral vacuum. Speer's ability to rationalize made possible the technical implementation that Streicher's fanaticism could only inspire, but not execute. Gilbert's conclusion that resonated most in later psychology was his formulation of evil. When Hannah Arendt coined the term banality of evil to describe Adolf Eichmann in 1963, she was articulating something Gilbert had observed and documented 16 years earlier at Nuremberg, that the great crimes of history do not require monsters. They require ordinary people willing to compartmentalize their humanity when the system in which they operate demands it. While Gilbert worked with psychological freedom of movement, Major Leon Nathaniel Goldensohn, the prison psychiatrist for most of the trial, conducted his own interviews from a different perspective. Goldensohn died in 1961, and his notes remained unpublished for decades, until Robert Gellertley edited and published them in 2004 under the title The Nuremberg Interviews. Goldensohn's interviews complement Gilbert's work in significant ways because, while Gilbert primarily looked at defense mechanisms and attitudes toward judgment, Goldensohn explored the life stories, family relationships, personal trajectories that had led each man to where he was. What Goldensohn found confirmed and amplified Gilbert's conclusions that the Nuremberg defendants were not anomalous from the point of view of their psychological development. Many came from conventional families, had had childhoods without obvious traumas, had gone through the normal educational institutions of the Germany of their time. What had transformed them was not a factory defect, but the interplay between their character traits: narcissism, the need to belong, the propensity to obey, the capacity for rationalization, and a political system that rewarded exactly those traits and punished the opposites. Gustave Gilbert returned to the United States in 1946 after the trial concluded. He worked for a time as a chief psychologist at the Veterans Hospital of Lyons, New Jersey, treating veterans of both world wars who had suffered nervous breakdowns. In 1954, he was associate professor of psychology at Michigan State College. In 1961, as chairman of the Department of Psychology at Long Island University in Brooklyn, he was called to testify at the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem. At that trial, Gilbert described what the Nuremberg defendants, especially Kaltenbrunner and Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, had told him about Eichmann's role in the extermination. The court did not admit his psychological analyses of the Nuremberg prisoners as part of his official testimony, but his observations helped establish the scale of knowledge that existed at the highest levels of the regime about Eichmann's specific role. Gilbert died on February 6, 1977 in Manhasset, New York. He was 65 years old. His work with the Nuremberg defendants continued to be studied in universities and colleges, especially in the field of psychology. But his most enduring contribution was perhaps his simplest. He demonstrated that it was possible to sit down with the perpetrators of the greatest crimes of the 20th century, talk to them in a civilized manner for a year, and find not the abstract horror that the imagination prefers, but something more disturbing, more mundane, more difficult to integrate into any reassuring narrative about human nature. They were not monsters, they were men, and that's what made them so dangerous. I imagine being in a cell of 3 meters by 4. Artificial light enters through a small panel in the door. There is a bed, a table, a toilet. The man sitting in front of you has signed mass execution orders. He has presided over the extermination of millions of people, and now he's talking to you about art, about military history, about the talent needed for diplomacy. He's being smart. It's being funny even. He is being, in every external sense, a cultivated interlocutor. That was Gilbert's experience for 365 days. And what that experience destroyed was the comfortable distance we need to maintain between us and them. We need to believe that those who do horrible things are fundamentally different from those who don't, that there is a distinction of nature, not just circumstance or decision, between the perpetrator and the witness, between the criminal and the innocent. The results of intelligence tests, the conversations recorded, the behaviors observed in the dock and in the cells do not confirm this distance. They confirm that the same intelligence that allows a symphony to be built can be used to design an extermination camp, that the same capacity for loyalty that unites families can become, under certain institutional conditions, the tale that unites the perpetrators of genocide. That the same need to belong, to be recognized, to be loved, that defines us as species, can be exploited to make ordinary people do extraordinarily cruel things. The Nuremberg trial was the first attempt in history to apply international law to state crimes. Gilbert and Goldenson's work was the first systematic attempt to understand the psychology of those who committed them from the inside. 80 years later, the questions that work raised are still the most important questions that psychology, history, and moral philosophy can ask. Not because we don't have answers, but because the answers we have tell us something about ourselves that we prefer not to know.